History is about to be made in West Africa. Senegal has just announced that it is abandoning the CFA franc, a currency born in the ashes of colonialism, still used by more than 10 African countries today. For decades, critics have called it a symbol of economic slavery, a financial chain that ties African nations to Paris. But now, Senegal is breaking that chain. And here's the twist. Senegal isn't walking away alone. Alongside its West African neighbors, it is preparing to launch a brand new currency, the ECO. The plan is bold, ambitious, and historic. This currency is set to be rolled out in 2027, marking what could be the beginning of true monetary independence for the region. But bold plans invite bold questions. Will Senegal succeed in this daring quest to free itself from the grip of the CFA franc? Will France, whose influence and profits are directly tied to this colonial-era system, simply stand aside and allow it to happen? And perhaps most importantly, what does the average Senegalese citizen think? Do they see the ECO as the future, or as another dream that may never come to pass? The answers to these questions could determine the fate of an entire region, and whether Africa's long struggle for economic sovereignty is finally entering a new chapter. In recent years, France's grip on Africa has been slipping. Across the Sahel and beyond, its influence, once unquestioned, is now crumbling. And today, it seems that collapse may accelerate even further. Why? Because a colonial relic, the CFA franc, is finally being challenged. For decades, this currency symbolized French power in West Africa, but now it stands on the edge of extinction. And at the heart of this historic rebellion is Senegal, led by a fiery new duo, President Bassirou Diomaye Faye and his Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko. The idea of ditching the CFA franc wasn't born yesterday. It was one of Faye's boldest promises during his presidential campaign. Among his pledges to the Senegalese people, one stood out like a beacon. Under his leadership, Senegal would cast off the CFA franc and embrace a new currency, one that truly reflected sovereignty and independence. When he triumphed in the 2024 elections, he repeated this pledge with conviction, and the people believed a new dawn was coming. But in the months that followed, something unexpected happened. Faye's rhetoric softened. Instead of marching head-on toward breaking ties with Paris, he appeared to pivot, extending olive branches, pushing for deeper cooperation with France. To many who had placed their hopes in him, this shift felt like betrayal. Had the promise been an empty campaign slogan? Was Senegal's young president already bending to the same old pressures that had kept previous leaders in line? For a moment, it seemed like the dream of a sovereign currency, the ECO, was slipping away, but beneath the surface, forces were still moving. But perhaps President Faye's true goal is not to completely sever ties with France, but to redefine them, to build a relationship not built on dependency, but on mutual respect and mutual benefit. And in the past few months, his actions have sent a clear message that the days of subservience are over. First, he ended Senegal's decades-long defense pact with France, an agreement that had allowed French troops to maintain a permanent presence in the country. That chapter is now closed. The French soldiers were ordered to leave, their once unquestioned influence in Dakar brought to an end. Then came the second, and perhaps even more significant decision. Faye stood before the world and repeated the pledge he had made during his campaign. Senegal would abandon the CFA franc, not just for itself, but in favor of a new, unified currency for all of ECOWAS, the ECO. A bold plan, one that challenges not just France's hold over Senegal, but its economic grip across the entire region. Taken together, these moves speak volumes. They signal that Faye does not intend to be a puppet of Paris. Instead, he envisions a new relationship, one that acknowledges history but refuses to be chained by it. Because one of the most damaging relics of that colonial era still lingers today, and it is not hidden. It is the CFA franc. And now, Senegal is preparing to bury it once and for all. Officially born on December 26, 1945, the CFA franc was not an African creation. It was a colonial design. Issued by decree of General Charles de Gaulle, its purpose was clear: to bind France's colonies together under one economic system, to secure control over their resources, and to shape their political destinies. Behind its neat currency notes lay the logic of empire: unity for Paris, dependency for Africa. Today, nearly 80 years later, the CFA franc is still in use across 14 African countries. In West Africa, Benin, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Bissau, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo. In Central Africa, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Chad, Congo-Brazzaville, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon. Together, these nations make up two vast monetary unions, yet they remain tethered to Europe through a currency that was never truly their own. The mechanism is just as controversial as its origin. By monetary accord, the CFA franc is pegged to the euro, giving it stability but also binding it to European financial policy. And more tellingly, the central banks of both the West African states and the Central African states are required to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves into a special operating account held by the French Treasury. In plain terms, half of Africa's financial reserves sit under lock and key in Paris. Defenders of the system point to its credibility and stability. They argue that no CFA franc nation has ever plunged into hyperinflation or experienced a major financial collapse. They call it a safeguard, a financial anchor in turbulent waters. But critics see it differently, not as stability, but as stagnation, not as protection, but as dependence. For them, the CFA franc is not just a currency, it is a chain. And now, that chain is being tested like never before. While defenders of the CFA franc point to stability, the reality is that African nations are paying a steep price for this so-called security. Let's start with the basics. Every CFA member state is required to deposit at least half, 50%, of its foreign exchange reserves into a special account held by the French Treasury. Today, that amounts to roughly 10 billion euros locked away in Paris. And in return, France guarantees the unlimited convertibility of CFA francs into euros. But ask yourself, does this make any sense? Why would a supposedly independent nation have to store half of its reserves in the vault of another country? To many African economists, this arrangement is not financial cooperation, but financial control. As Malian economist Cheikhna Bounadjim Cissé bluntly puts it, it makes no economic sense. In our opinion, it is just a way for France to continue exercising control over its former colonies. And the problem doesn't stop there. By tying the CFA franc to the euro, the system locks African economies into a position of disadvantage. The peg keeps the CFA franc artificially strong, which means African goods become more expensive on the global market. Unlike nations with independent currencies, CFA zone countries cannot simply adjust their exchange rates to boost exports or protect local industries. If they want to devalue, they must wait for Paris, and Paris rarely acts. The result? African exports become less competitive, while imports, especially from countries with weaker currencies like China, become cheaper. Finished goods flood the markets of West and Central Africa, while local industries struggle to survive. Instead of industrializing, CFA franc nations remain stuck in the role they were assigned in the colonial era, exporters of raw commodities, importers of everything else. Think about that. A system designed in 1945 still shapes the economic destiny of over 150 million Africans today. Stability, perhaps, but at what cost? So, who actually benefits from the CFA franc? Supporters of the system often argue that the currency has kept inflation low in Francophone Africa compared to other regions. And yes, that part may be true. But behind the glossy surface of low inflation lies a harsher reality: weak economies, fewer jobs, and limited growth. Stability may sound attractive to investors abroad, but it suffocates local production at home. Here's the paradox. The CFA franc's strength makes it easy for foreign investors to enter and profit from African markets. But that same strength makes it harder for African industries to compete. Factories close, jobs disappear, the cycle of dependency deepens. In simple terms, the CFA franc works like a gatekeeper. It opens the door wide for outsiders, while keeping Africans locked out of their own economic potential. So who wins in this arrangement? The answer is clear: major French corporations and overseas companies that enjoy easy access to African markets. Executives of the zone's central banks, who benefit from the prestige and power that comes with managing reserves in Paris. Local elites, politicians and businessmen, who repatriate their wealth, whether earned legally or otherwise, through the safety of French-controlled accounts. And of course, heads of state too cautious or too complicit to challenge France's grip. But the ordinary African citizen, the farmer, the trader, The factory worker? They gain nothing. For them, the CFA franc is not a symbol of stability. It is a barrier to opportunity, a colonial relic disguised as progress. With all this in mind, it becomes clear why leaders like Senegal's President Bassirou Diomaye Faye and Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré are pushing to replace the CFA franc. In Senegal, Faye's advocacy has struck a powerful chord. Even French media outlets like France TV Info admitted in 2024 that abandoning the CFA franc is an extremely popular measure in Senegal and other West African CFA users. For millions of people, the CFA franc is more than just money. It is a symbol of continued French tutelage, a relic of colonial control. And across the Sahel, anti-colonial sentiment is rising fast, fueled by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger's decisions in recent years to exit the CFA zone altogether. But here comes the next question. If Senegal abandons the CFA franc, what comes after? The answer is a new vision, a new currency, the ECO. The ECO isn't a brand new idea. It was first adopted back in July 2019 by the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS. It was supposed to launch in 2020, a bold experiment in monetary sovereignty. But then, the global COVID-19 pandemic struck, derailing the plan and forcing leaders to hit pause. Now, momentum is building again. Recently, West African finance ministers and central bank governors gathered in Abuja, Nigeria to breathe life back into the single currency project. Their message was clear. The ECO is not dead. The vision remains alive, to create a unified currency that can propel economic growth, strengthen regional trade, and give West Africa a stronger, independent voice on the global stage. And Senegal, under Faye and Sonko, is positioning itself at the forefront of this historic movement. So yes, Senegal's plan to ditch the CFA franc and embrace the ECO is a powerful idea. On paper, it promises freedom, it promises sovereignty, it promises a chance for Senegal and its neighbors to finally chart their own monetary destiny. But the real question is, will this plan ever see the light of day? The road to 2027 is filled with obstacles, and they come from both within and without. From within, even though leaders like President Faye are pushing the ECO forward, not every ECOWAS member is on board. Some, like Ivory Coast's President Alassane Ouattara, have always defended the CFA franc. Back in February 2019, after meeting Emmanuel Macron in Paris, Ouattara told reporters, "I don't understand this false debate." He described the CFA franc as solid, well-managed, and appreciated, and even urged that all such discussions should end. His words were not accidental. Ouattara has long been seen as one of France's most loyal allies in West Africa, someone who will always protect Paris's interests, no matter the cost. And this is the problem. How can the ECO become reality when the project itself is divided? When some leaders fight for independence, while others remain tied to the colonial past? But then comes the greater challenge: France itself. Will Paris quietly sit back and watch one of its most powerful instruments of influence crumble? History suggests otherwise. Time and again, whenever an African nation has tried to leave the CFA franc, France has pushed back, hard. Take Guinea in the 1960s. When it abandoned the CFA and issued its own national currency, the country was suddenly flooded with counterfeit notes, destabilizing its economy overnight, a warning perhaps to others who dared to follow the same path. And Guinea is not alone. From political sabotage to financial blackmail, France has never hesitated to protect its interests in Africa. Which leads us to the million-dollar question. Can Senegal, with the backing of ECOWAS, succeed where others have failed? Or will history repeat itself? In 1962, Mali made history. It became the very first Francophone African country to ditch the CFA franc, striking out with its own currency, the Malian franc. It was a bold act of defiance, a declaration that Mali would no longer be bound by colonial chains. But freedom came at a price. Internal divisions weakened the new system, and France, fiercely determined to keep its former colonies under control, applied relentless pressure. 2 decades later, the dream was over. By 1984, the Malian franc was abandoned, and Mali was dragged back into the CFA zone. Another victory for France, another defeat for sovereignty. Fast forward to 2011. This time, the battle was in Ivory Coast. President Laurent Gbagbo, who had openly considered pulling his country out of the CFA Franc, found himself at the center of a political storm. After a disputed election, Western powers moved quickly to remove him. French troops, backed by the United Nations, intervened militarily. The operation was led by none other than Alassane Ouattara, Gbagbo's rival, and the man who today still sits as Ivory Coast's president. In the chaos, over 3,000 civilians were killed. Entire neighborhoods turned into killing fields. By any standard of international law, these deaths should have been investigated as war crimes. Ouattara himself should have been summoned to trial. But guess what happened? Nothing. No trial, no accountability, no justice for the dead. Instead, Ouattara was rewarded, ushered into power with the full blessing of France and its allies. Ivory Coast, one of the wealthiest nations in West Africa, remained tightly bound to the CFA Franc system. The message was clear. Any leader who dared to challenge the currency of empire would be removed, one way or another. With France's backing, it was Laurent Gbagbo, not Alassane Ouattara, who ended up in the dock. Gbagbo was hauled before the International Criminal Court in The Hague, accused of crimes against humanity. He spent nearly 10 years fighting the charges before eventually being acquitted. But by then, the damage was done. His presidency was over, his political career shattered, and Ivory Coast remained firmly under France's economic orbit. And France's pressure didn't stop at military intervention. Still in 2011, Paris exploited its influence inside the Central Bank of West African states, the very institution that manages the CFA Franc. From its seats on the bank's decision-making bodies, France moved to block refinancing for Côte d'Ivoire, tightening the economic noose around Gbagbo. At the same time, French banking giants like BNP Paribas and Société Générale shuttered their Ivorian branches, plunging the economy into paralysis. It was economic warfare, waged in the name of stability. All of this makes one thing painfully clear. Any country that dares to leave the CFA Franc must be ready for sabotage. And that is precisely the danger facing Senegal's ECO project. The 2027 launch may be ambitious, but history has shown that France will not quietly allow one of its last colonial relics to be dismantled. And already, Paris has an advantage. Sitting comfortably in power is its most loyal ally in the region, Alassane Ouattara. As president of Ivory Coast and a senior figure in ECOWAS, Ouattara occupies a strategic position. Through him, France can influence the bloc from within, stalling decisions, sowing division, and quietly undermining any serious move toward the ECO. In other words, the battle for Africa's financial freedom will not just be fought in the streets or the parliaments, it will be fought in the shadows, behind closed doors, where France still holds powerful cards. However, there is still a glimmer of hope. If Senegal continues to stand strong, and if future elections bring leaders who are not beholden to France, the vision of sovereignty may yet survive. But across the border, things look different. In Ivory Coast, Alassane Ouattara has already paved his way to another term in office. Two of his strongest rivals have been banned from contesting, leaving the playing field wide open for his victory. And with Ouattara secure, France maintains one of its most reliable allies at the heart of ECOWAS, where the fate of the ECO will be decided. But Senegal has made it clear, it will not wait forever. President Faye has pledged that if the ECO fails, Senegal will not hesitate to create its own national currency. In fact, the groundwork has already begun. A roadmap exists, one that points directly toward breaking free from the CFA Franc. The plan is nothing short of revolutionary. It begins with the creation of a fully independent national central bank, one that can refinance state expenditures at 0% interest. It includes the demonetization of gold, ending its export, and instead building a sovereign reserve to back Senegal's economy. Gold reserves currently stored in Paris and across the world would be repatriated, returning wealth to where it belongs, at home. Public debt would be reprofiled, private debt could even be canceled through monetary fiat, and a deposit insurance scheme would be installed to protect small savers. Finally, Senegal would establish a national stock exchange, a financial hub designed to channel investment into local industries instead of foreign corporations. This is the roadmap. Bold, risky, transformative, And for the first time in decades, it suggests that Senegal may be willing to walk the same daring path as Mali once did. Only this time, with lessons learned and with a generation determined to never again be trapped by colonial chains. The question now is simple but monumental. Can Senegal succeed where others have failed? Or will France strike back once again to protect its empire of money? Faye's push is not just a national gamble. It is part of a groundbreaking shift sweeping across West Africa. A new generation of leaders is rising, young, bold, and unafraid to reject the chains of neo-colonialism. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré has cast out France and rallied his people around sovereignty. In Mali, Assimi Goïta has defied decades of foreign control. And in Niger, Abdourahmane Tiani has stood against the old order, forging alliances that once seemed unthinkable. Now, Senegal stands at the crossroads. If President Faye succeeds in tearing down the CFA Franc and replacing it with something truly sovereign, it will embolden others. It could inspire a wave of reform, rewriting the future of an entire region. But if he fails, if France and its allies manage to sabotage the dream, the status quo will harden, the CFA Franc will remain, and the shadow of colonialism will continue to loom over West Africa. The stakes could not be higher. This is more than a battle over currency. It is a battle over dignity, over sovereignty, over the right of African nations to control their own destiny. What do you think? Can Senegal succeed where others have stumbled? Or will France once again prove that it will stop at nothing to protect its empire of influence? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into Africa's struggle for true independence.